Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. I asked myself a question that no one had the answer to. What happens when the darkness becomes so thick that even light cannot escape it? I had never truly understood the weight of that question until it consumed me, until it became my reality. But even now, as I stand at the edge of the abyss, I still don't know if I can escape it. The house was silent, eerily silent. I could hear the creaking of the old wooden floors beneath my feet, each step making a sound that seemed too loud, too intrusive. But beyond that, there was nothing. No hum of the refrigerator, no murmur of traffic from the street outside. Just the suffocating quiet that wrapped around me like a thick, unseen fog. I was alone. And I was beginning to realize that I had been alone for far longer than I had ever known. This house, my house, had once felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could retreat from the world. But now, it felt like a prison. The walls seemed to grow closer with each passing day, and the air felt heavier, thicker. I had grown accustomed to the isolation, but something had shifted, something I couldn't explain. The feeling of being watched, of something just beyond my reach, had become almost constant. At night, I could hear whispers that didn't belong to me, to anyone. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to move when I wasn't looking, and the walls, once familiar, seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't understand. I had tried to rationalize it, of course. It was just my mind, I told myself. The stress of being alone for so long, the memories that would creep in during the quiet moments, had made me paranoid. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something I could neither explain nor escape. The first real sign that something was wrong came one evening while I was sitting in the living room, reading a book. It was the sort of evening I had come to enjoy, still and peaceful. But then the temperature dropped. The air grew colder, and I found myself shivering, despite the warmth of the fire in the hearth. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was winter, after all. But then I heard it, a soft rustling noise, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the hallway outside. I sat up straighter, the book now forgotten in my hands. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It's just the house settling, I told myself. It's nothing. But the rustling continued. It wasn't the sound of a house settling. It was the sound of something, or someone, moving, walking just out of sight. My heart began to race. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself to get up, to check the hallway, but my body refused to move. I was frozen, caught in that inescapable moment of fear, where you know something is wrong but can't bring yourself to face it. The rustling grew louder, closer, as if whatever was there had started moving toward me. I closed my eyes, tried to block out the noise, but it was too real, too undeniable. I heard a soft thud, like a footstep. And then another. Closer. Suddenly, I was no longer sitting in the living room. I was in a vast emptiness, surrounded by dark, swirling shapes. The floor beneath me was gone, replaced by a thick black void. I felt weightless, suspended in the air. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence. I opened my eyes, gasping for air, and found myself back in the living room, the fire crackling softly, the shadows flickering in the dim light. It was just a moment, I told myself. It was just a moment of panic. Nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The room felt different now, as if it were suffused with a presence that wasn't there before. The shadows that stretched across the floor seemed longer, deeper. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to be gathering, like it was waiting for something. I forced myself to stand and walk to the hallway, but the air in the house had changed. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the walls seeming to close in on me with each step I took. The light from the living room seemed dimmer, as though it were being swallowed by the darkness. I reached the end of the hall and turned to look down the staircase leading to the basement. It was dark down there, so dark that even the light from above couldn't break through. I had always avoided the basement, but something was pulling me toward it now. Something I couldn't explain. I stepped toward the stairs, my hand hovering over the railing. The air down there felt thick, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear a faint sound, a low hum, like the distant murmur of voices. And then I saw it. A figure, tall, shadowed, unmoving, standing at the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for me. I took a step back, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, still and silent, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. What is it? What does it want? The thoughts flooded my mind, but no answers came. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from somewhere above. A window shattering. The sound was so real, so vivid, that it jolted me back to the present. My body jerked, and I snapped out of my trance. The figure was gone. I turned and fled back to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I entered, the room was no longer the same. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows stretched longer. The air felt thick, suffocating. The house, my sanctuary, had become something else. Something darker. And I could feel it. The darkness was closing in. It was only a matter of time before it swallowed everything. I didn't know it had started, but the isolation had begun to feel like something more than just loneliness. The house was no longer a home, it was an empty shell, a place I merely inhabited. And yet, it seemed alive. It seemed to pulse with something I couldn't understand. The silence had become unbearable, the quiet oppressive, as though it were mocking me. I had always told myself that I could live alone, that I didn't need anyone. It was true, wasn't it? I had learned to adapt. Over time, I even began to think of the silence as a kind of comfort. But that had changed. Now, every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside, seemed to echo with a deeper meaning. The very air around me felt wrong. I felt trapped, not just in the house, but in something much bigger. I sat in the living room, as I had so many times before, the soft flicker of the fire casting shadows on the walls. But those shadows weren't the same anymore. They seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and shifting in unnatural ways. I couldn't take my eyes off them. It's just the light, just the fire. I tried to convince myself, but deep down I knew it wasn't true. The fire wasn't creating those shapes. They weren't just shadows, they were something else. Something that didn't belong. I felt a chill run down my spine, a coldness that wasn't from the weather. The temperature in the room had dropped once again, but this time it was accompanied by a low hum. Not from the fire. not from anything in the room. It was a deep, resonating sound, like the very house itself was vibrating. I stood up, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and into my feet. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs felt unsteady, as though I were standing on the edge of a precipice. I reached out to steady myself against the wall, but the moment my hand touched the surface, I recoiled. The wall was cold, unnaturally cold, like it had been pulled from the depths of winter. I looked around the room, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. But I saw nothing. The fire crackled, the light flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought perhaps I had imagined it all. And then the whispering started. Soft at first, like a breeze brushing against my ears. But then it grew clearer, more distinct. Words, fragments, uttered in a language I couldn't understand. The voices were low and distant, but they were coming from everywhere, surrounding me. They didn't belong to anyone I knew. They didn't belong to anyone at all. I tried to push the sound out of my mind. I tried to focus on something, anything else. But I couldn't. The whispering wouldn't stop. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking to me, telling me things I couldn't comprehend. In a panic, I turned toward the hallway, and that's when I saw it. The figure from before, the one at the bottom of the stairs, was back. It stood at the end of the hallway, bathed in shadows, its form indistinct but undeniably there. It didn't move. It didn't need to. I could feel its presence pressing against me, pushing into the air I was breathing. No, I thought, shaking my head. This can't be real. It's just my mind playing tricks. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to breathe steadily, trying to control the pounding of my heart. But when I opened them again, the figure was still there. This time, I wasn't paralyzed by fear. I couldn't afford to be. I turned quickly and hurried toward the back door, hoping to escape, to break free of whatever was happening. But when I reached for the handle, I stopped. The door wouldn't open. I tugged at it with all my strength, panic surging through me. The door was locked, impossibly locked, as though someone, or something, had sealed it from the other side. I pulled harder, my breath shallow, but it wouldn't budge. I heard it then, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. The hum. The same low, resonating vibration that had filled the room before. But now it was deeper, almost painful to listen to. It was as though the very air had become thick, dense, pressing down on me from all sides. I turned back toward the hallway. The figure was gone. The house was silent once again, but it wasn't the same silence. It was pregnant with something unspeakable, something I couldn't grasp. I looked around, desperately searching for something to explain this, anything that could bring me back to reality. But the walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows growing longer, darker, until they almost consumed the entire room. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The floorboards, beneath me, had begun to warp, their edges curling up as if they were alive. Something was crawling beneath them. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel it, scratching and scraping at the underside of the wood. The scraping grew louder, faster, more frantic. The entire house seemed to shake with the movement, as though something was trying to break free. The walls groaned, and the floor trembled underfoot. I stepped back, my mind racing, my thoughts a blur. My heart pounded in my chest. The house was alive. It was alive, and it was trying to swallow me whole. I reached for the door once again, but this time I didn't hesitate. The coldness of the metal handle sent a shock through me as I yanked it open. But when I stepped outside, I was met with nothing but darkness. The world beyond the door was empty and silent. I turned back toward the house. The light from inside barely cut through the blackness surrounding me. But in that fleeting moment, I thought I saw something. Something staring back at me from the windows. I didn't look twice. I ran. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the house. It followed me, tugging at the edges of my mind, pulling me back toward it. I had no choice but to return. The air outside was suffocating, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The streets were silent, too silent. No crickets chirped, no cars passed by. It was as though the world had ceased to exist beyond the walls of that house. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one colder than the last, the chill sinking into my bones. I had run far enough to think I could escape. I had convinced myself I was free. But deep down, I knew better. The house, that thing, it wasn't just a building. It was a presence. A living, breathing force that followed me, pulling me back toward it. With every step, I felt it. The weight of the earth thickening, pressing down on my chest, dragging me toward the familiar yet horrifying darkness. I turned around, half expecting to see the house looming behind me, the windows staring out like eyes in the night. But there was nothing there. Just the black emptiness of the street stretching endlessly. Still, I could feel its pull, the invisible thread that tied me to it. It was as though I was tethered to the house, a prisoner caught between its walls, bound to return. I stopped. My mind was screaming at me to turn and run faster, to put more distance between myself and the madness. But I couldn't move. I stood frozen, my feet rooted to the cold pavement beneath me. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might explode in my chest. The silence, it wasn't natural. It was suffocating, pressing against my skull, making it hard to think. And then it came again, the hum. At first, it was just a whisper in the distance, like a deep vibration that rattled my teeth. But then it grew louder. A deep, resonating sound that seemed to come from the very ground itself. It made my skin crawl, like the earth was trembling beneath me. I could hear it clearly now. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence. A force. And it was growing. I turned, slowly at first, my legs shaky beneath me, and there it was. The house, standing at the end of the street. But it wasn't just standing, it was waiting. The lights inside flickered like a heartbeat, and the windows gleamed in the dark, staring down at me like eyes that had been watching from the very beginning. I could feel it watching me, pressing down on my thoughts, forcing my body to move against my will. I had to go back. I don't know why I didn't just keep running. Maybe it was the fear that kept me rooted to that spot. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper. But I knew one thing for sure, the house wouldn't let me go. It wanted me back. It needed me. I turned and began walking, my feet heavy, each step like a weight dragging me down. The hum grew louder with every step, the sound vibrating through my bones, making my teeth ache. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a force that seeped into my skin, into my very soul. When I reached the door, I didn't hesitate. My hand reached out before I even realized what I was doing. The cold metal of the doorknob felt wrong in my grip, like it didn't belong to this world. It turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open slowly, as though it had been waiting for me. Inside, the darkness was thicker than before. It pressed against me, smothering me, as if the house itself had swallowed the light. The air smelled different too. It was heavier, thick with dust and something else, something sharp, like the scent of rust or blood. I could feel it in my lungs, clogging up my breath as I stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I walked through the house. The walls, once comforting in their familiarity, now seemed like strange, looming sentinels. The shadows moved as if they had a life of their own, shifting and twisting in the corners of my vision. I could hear them now, the whispers, faint at first, then clearer. They were all around me, coming from the walls, from the air itself. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were words. Words I couldn't understand. I froze. In front of me, at the top of the stairs, stood the figure. The same shape I had seen before, but now it was clearer, more solid. It wasn't the same shape as before, though. The figure had changed, morphed, like it had absorbed something of the house's madness. Its form was jagged, distorted, as if it were made of shadows and broken glass. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it staring at me. It didn't move. It didn't need to. No. I thought, my heart racing. Not again. I won't let it take me again. But it wasn't me it was after. The whispers grew louder, now words tumbling over one another. The house was speaking through it. The figure was its messenger. I could hear it now, clear as day. You cannot leave. You belong to us. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, rooted in place by a force I couldn't explain. My mind screamed for me to move, to break free, but my legs were frozen, my arms heavy at my sides. I couldn't escape. The house wouldn't let me. And the more I tried to resist, the stronger its pull became. I was nothing more than a pawn, trapped in a place that defied all sense of reality. I felt it then. A cold, icy pressure at the back of my neck, like fingers brushing against my skin, just barely there. It wasn't a breeze. It wasn't the wind. It was the house, reaching out, touching me, claiming me. I tried to break free. I tried to scream, to move, but it was too late. The figure was moving toward me now, its form rippling with unnatural motion. The house was closing in, and I could feel its walls pressing against me, pushing me deeper into the void. There was no way out. I had entered the darkness, and there would be no escape. The darkness consumed everything. I could no longer see my hands in front of me, nor feel the solid floor beneath my feet. I had stepped beyond the boundaries of the world I knew. The house, it was alive, suffocating me, twisting the space into something unfamiliar, unrecognizable. There were no windows here, no doors, only endless corridors stretching into an abyss of black. My breath came in shallow gasps. The air felt thick, as though it was full of something I couldn't touch, something unseen but always present, hovering just out of reach. It was no longer just the cold. It was pressure, a weight on my chest that squeezed the life from me with every heartbeat. I wanted to move, to escape, but the paralysis had spread. My legs felt like they were trapped in thick mud, every step slower, harder. I heard the whispers again. They were softer now, like a dull hum that threaded through the silence, slipping into my ears. The words weren't clear, but I could feel their meaning seep into my skin. They were here. The house wasn't empty. It never had been. I had only thought I was alone. The figure, that thing at the top of the stairs, it hadn't followed me, but I could feel its presence. It was waiting. watching, always watching. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. Every time I tried, my throat tightened, the words choking in my mouth like something had crawled inside to suffocate me. I couldn't move. The walls were closing in, bending inwards, like they were narrowing the space around me. I stumbled, hands stretched out in front of me, blindly groping for something to hold onto, anything to stop the crushing force that seemed to press against my body. And then, from the depths of the darkness, a shape began to form. It wasn't like the figure before. This one, it had a face. The face of a woman. Or something that had once been a woman. Her eyes were hollow, black voids, and her mouth hung open in an endless scream as if she were trapped in time, her agony caught in a moment that never ended. I couldn't look away. My body refused to move. I wanted to turn, to run, but the thing, I could feel it moving, not towards me, but through me, its presence brushing against my very soul. I didn't need to see it. I could feel its eyes on me, reading me, ripping away every fragment of my thoughts. "You have come too far," it whispered. The voice was soft, like it came from the walls themselves. I didn't know if it was the woman or the house speaking. But I could feel it. It knew me. It knew everything about me. "You cannot escape, not from here." The voice lingered in the air like smoke, wrapping around me, tightening until I felt suffocated by it. I gasped for air, but there was no air to breathe. The space around me was a hollow void, a vacuum that had consumed every shred of light. The pressure on my chest grew unbearable, and I could feel my heartbeat quicken as panic surged through my veins. I need to escape. My mind screamed it, but my body refused to cooperate. I looked down at my feet, desperate to focus on something familiar, something that would ground me. But there was nothing. The floor had become a black mirror, reflecting nothing but the void. A cold, clammy hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but no one was there. I could hear my ragged breathing in the dark, but there was no sound from behind me. The touch, it had been real. I felt it, sharp, icy, like the cold of a grave. I took a step back, my feet stumbling, my balance faltering. And then it happened. A sound. A crack. Like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the walls. I turned my head toward the sound, but there was nothing to see. The walls were solid black, empty. And yet, the crackling sound continued, growing louder, closer. It wasn't just a sound, it was a movement. The walls were shifting, shaping themselves into something. Something that wasn't human. I took a step forward, heart racing, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The sound of the crackling grew louder, the air thick with tension. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what the house was making. But I couldn't stop myself. I turned, and there it was. The wall had split open, revealing a gaping mouth. No, not a mouth, a hole. A black void that seemed to suck in the very air around it, stretching deeper into nothingness. And from within, something was emerging. A figure, twisted and grotesque, its limbs long and spindly. Its skin was blackened and cracked, like the bark of a dead tree. Its eyes glowed, two dull red orbs, fixated on me, burning through the darkness. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. I felt its hunger, its need, its desire to consume. It was as though it was waiting for me to understand. It was calling me. I stumbled backward, the fear flooding through me like ice, numbing my body, freezing me in place. My heart raced so fast I thought it might stop. But I couldn't look away. It was pulling me in, drawing me closer with each step I took. The walls were no longer walls. The floor beneath me was a trap, a pit that had opened to swallow me whole. There was nowhere to run. The darkness, it was alive. And I was the prey. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. It was as if my voice had been stolen by the very air around me. The red eyes of the figure before me were the only thing that existed in the suffocating blackness. It was drawing closer, its twisted limbs stretching and contorting unnaturally, the skin stretching over the bone like it was being pulled by invisible strings. I could hear the sickening crack of joints, the rustle of something breaking within it, as though it wasn't supposed to exist in the shape it had taken. It moved with a fluidity that was wrong, like a marionette being jerked by a puppeteer who had lost all control. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at my body to run, to do anything to escape this nightmare, but the fear had a grip on me so tight I could feel it in my marrow. The walls around me, no, the entire house, seemed to close in, the space shrinking, the pressure growing. The ground beneath me was soft, sinking into the void, as though it were made of smoke. A cold wind swept through the room, even though there was no window, no open door. It wasn't a gust of air. It was something more, something with intent. I felt it brush against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. It spoke to me, not with words, but with its touch, its presence, its hunger. I felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing me closer to the thing that emerged from the wall. Its eyes never left me, and in them, I saw something terrible, something that wasn't just hunger, but expectation. It was waiting for me to make the first move. It wanted me to make the choice. It wanted me to give in. In the midst of my fear, there was a strange clarity. I wasn't just trapped in this room. I was trapped in this house, in this place, in this moment, as though everything around me had been waiting for me. There was no way out, no escape, because I had already become part of it. The darkness was inside me, in my very thoughts, my memories. The air shifted again, this time thick with the smell of rot, decay, and something sweeter, something like blood. I could taste it, bitter on my tongue, as it filled my senses. I gagged, but there was nowhere to expel it, no space for it to leave. It was as though the very atmosphere had turned foul, pressing down on me, suffocating me with its putrid weight. I stumbled back, only to find myself slamming into something solid. I spun around, but the figure had moved. It was right behind me, its cold breath on my neck, its long fingers brushing the back of my skull. I could feel its presence without needing to see it. It was so close that I could feel the terrible heat radiating from its form, even as I knew that it was no longer human. It was something else, something older and darker. It had been waiting for me all along. My head swam with a sickening realization. The house wasn't just a place. It was alive. It had been aware of me from the very moment I had entered, pulling me in with every breath, every step. The memories that I thought I had left behind, those moments, those people, were all part of this place, part of the same twisted web that now ensnared me. They had all led me here, led me to this very moment where there was no escape. No way out. My fingers brushed against the wall behind me. It was cold, wet, like the surface of a grave. My breath caught in my throat as I felt the texture shift beneath my fingers. The wall, it was no longer solid. It was breathing, pulsing, alive. I jerked my hand away as though it had burned me. The thing behind me moved again, its presence overwhelming, the air thick with the stench of decay. Its voice was not words, but a sound that reverberated deep inside my skull, as though it were speaking directly to my mind. You cannot run. You are already part of this place. I closed my eyes, unable to look at the thing anymore, unable to bear the weight of its gaze. But even with my eyes closed, I could see it. I could feel it. The darkness had seeped into my thoughts, my very soul, and there was no place left untouched by it. You are mine now. The voice filled my mind like the last thing I would ever hear. It was the sound of death, the sound of the end, and I realized that the true horror of this place wasn't the thing in front of me, or the walls that closed in on me. It was that I had already become part of it. I had always been a part of it. There was no escaping this. No waking up from it. And then, silence. The silence was suffocating. It was final. I could feel it closing in, wrapping around me like a shroud, but in that silence, I realized something terrible. The thing behind me was gone. There was no trace of it. No sound. No movement. It had taken me, it had already taken me, and I was left alone in the dark. But the darkness had no boundaries. The house had no walls. The horror had no end. I opened my eyes, but the world had dissolved into nothingness. There was no light, no sound. Just the dark, swallowing everything. And somewhere, far in the distance, I heard the faintest whisper. You are still here. It all started with a question, one that I couldn't shake off. Why did it feel like something was slipping through my fingers, something invisible but undeniable? The more I tried to focus, the more it faded away, leaving only a lingering sense of loss. The festival was supposed to be a celebration, a time to remember the past, but something about it felt off. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and damp earth, as if the ground itself carried the weight of years long gone. I was just another spectator, wandering through the crowds, my mind too preoccupied to truly enjoy the festivities. The flickering lanterns cast long shadows on the ground, and the music, though lively, seemed to echo in a hollow way. I had always been drawn to history, fascinated by the way old stories and objects could hold the essence of lives that once were. That's why, when I saw something unusual by the edge of the market square, I couldn't resist. A collection of discarded items, small trinkets, broken tools, withered books strewn across the ground as if forgotten in haste. There was no explanation for them, no reason they should be there. But something about them tugged at me. As I knelt to inspect one of the objects, a faded pocket watch, its hands frozen in time, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the cold of the evening air, but something deeper, something that made my skin prickle with unease. I picked up the watch, and for a moment, I swore I could hear the faintest ticking, as if the past itself was trying to speak to me. The crowd around me continued to laugh and chatter, oblivious to what I was feeling. But in the quiet of that moment, the world felt strangely distant. I couldn't shake the sensation that the objects before me were not just remnants of the past, but fragments of lives that once were. Each piece, a small puzzle, holding secrets I couldn't begin to understand. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness, a soft rustling from behind me. I turned, expecting to find someone walking past, but the square was empty, save for the distant glow of lanterns. My heart quickened, my pulse racing as I scanned the surroundings. There was nothing there. I told myself it was nothing. Just the wind. But even as I thought it, I couldn't escape the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. The air seemed thicker now, as though it was pressing in on me. The objects around me, those forgotten things, felt more alive somehow, as though they were calling to me, beckoning me to discover their stories. I stood up, my hand still clutching the pocket watch. I wasn't sure what to do with it, or why I couldn't just walk away, but something told me that leaving would be a mistake. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and the shadows, which had once been playful and innocent, now appeared darker, more menacing. I was about to take a step when I heard it again, this time louder, unmistakable. Footsteps. But they weren't the normal rhythm of a person walking. They were too slow, too deliberate. The sound echoed through the square, as if something, or someone, was moving just beyond the reach of the lantern light. I looked around again, my heart pounding. Nothing. The square remained as empty as before. But the feeling, the sense that something was wrong, was overwhelming. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as though the very air had changed, thick with something ancient, something that didn't belong. I glanced down at the pocket watch in my hand. The ticking was gone. In its place, there was only silence. And then, a voice, barely a whisper, slipped through the cracks in my mind. You shouldn't have touched it. I froze. The voice wasn't just in my ears, it was inside my head. A cold, creeping sensation washed over me. The watch was no longer just an object. It was a link, a connection to something else. Something wrong. And now was when I realized this was no longer just a forgotten object. This was a piece of something much larger, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I stood frozen, the pocket watch still gripped tightly in my hand, its cold surface sending chills through my fingertips. The voice, though faint, echoed in my mind with an unsettling clarity. I tried to dismiss it as a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The air had thickened, the once familiar surroundings now felt suffocating, as if the shadows themselves were closing in on me. I glanced around once more. The festival continued in the distance, but the sound of it, the laughter, the music, felt muffled, as if it were happening on the other side of a wall. My gaze flicked back to the objects scattered across the ground. There was something about them now, something almost expectant, as though they were waiting for me to do something, something that would bring me closer to understanding whatever it was that had taken hold of this place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the pocket watch. Its face, cracked and worn, seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. I turned it over in my hand, trying to decipher any markings or inscriptions that might offer a clue. But the back was smooth, featureless, save for a faint engraving that, under closer inspection, appeared to be a name. Adrian S. The name sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't a name I recognized, but something about it felt wrong. The way it sat there, etched into the metal, seemed almost out of place, like it had been deliberately hidden from view, waiting for me to find it. I looked up from the watch, my pulse quickening. The rustling had stopped, but the oppressive silence remained. I glanced toward the shadows at the edge of the square, where the lanterns struggled to cast their light. There was something there, just out of sight, something that didn't belong. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn my back on this strange feeling and forget I'd ever seen these forgotten relics. But I couldn't. Something was compelling me to stay, to uncover the truth behind these objects, behind this strange sensation of being watched. A creak echoed from somewhere nearby, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness. I flinched, turning toward the source of the sound. It came from an old wooden shed at the far end of the square. It was a small structure, weathered by years of neglect, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. The shed had always been a part of the festival grounds, but I had never really paid attention to it before. Now, it felt like the only place that mattered. Without thinking, I began to walk toward it, my footsteps muffled on the dirt path. The pocket watch felt heavier in my hand with every step, as if it were pulling me toward the shed, urging me forward. As I neared the door, I noticed something strange, a faint light coming from within, flickering in time with my heartbeat. It wasn't the soft, warm glow of a lantern or a candle. No, this light was colder, almost unnatural, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I reached for the door handle, but my hand hesitated just before touching it. The air around me seemed to shift again, the temperature dropping as if the very world around me were holding its breath. Then, from within the shed, came a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Don't come in." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The voice was different from the one in my head earlier. This one was real, and it was coming from inside the shed. I wanted to run, to bolt in the opposite direction, but something inside me refused to move. The desire to understand, to uncover the truth behind the objects and the voices, kept me rooted to the spot. Slowly, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The inside of the shed was dark, the flickering light barely illuminating the clutter of old tools, crates, and discarded festival decorations. It was the kind of place no one had bothered to clean in years. Dust hung thick in the air, and the smell of mildew mixed with the faint scent of something else, something metallic and old. I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me. The light flickered again, this time casting a long shadow across the floor. As my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a figure, standing motionless in the far corner. At first, I thought it was just another forgotten object, another relic of the past. But as I stepped closer, I realized it was something much worse. The figure was a mannequin, dressed in tattered clothing that seemed far too old for the festival. Its face was featureless, its eyes empty, but something about it felt alive. A cold wind swept through the shed, carrying with it the faint smell of decay. The mannequin's head tilted ever so slightly toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze burn into me, cold and unrelenting. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to shrink around me, the air growing thicker by the second. I reached out, drawn to the mannequin despite the overwhelming urge to flee. My fingers brushed against its hand, and a jolt of cold shot through me, freezing me in place. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the shed into darkness. In the silence, I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, the only sound in the oppressive blackness. Then, from the corner of the room, came a sound. A soft, low whisper, "Adrian. Adrian, come closer." The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had warned me earlier, the same voice that had been in my head. And now, it was calling my name. I stood frozen in the suffocating darkness, the voice still echoing in my mind, as though it were crawling through my bones. "Adrian. Adrian, come closer." The name was a whisper at first, but it felt like it was wrapping itself around me, pulling me deeper into the shadows. My pulse raced, my breath shallow as panic began to rise in my chest. For a moment, everything felt still, as if time itself had paused, holding its breath in anticipation. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the sound of my heartbeat. The mannequin in the corner, that hollow, lifeless thing, seemed to loom closer despite the absence of any movement. I had to move. I had to escape. But my legs wouldn't respond, as if they were bound by invisible chains. The darkness around me pressed in tighter, the smell of mildew and decay growing stronger, almost suffocating. My hand, still trembling, clenched around the pocket watch. It felt cold, colder than it should have been. I managed to tear my eyes away from the mannequin, and it was then that I realized something worse, something far worse, was unfolding. The light, that flickering, unnatural light, had returned, but it was no longer confined to the far corner. It was moving, sweeping across the shed like the slow advance of a tide, and as it passed over the old tools and crates, I noticed something. The shadows that had once been still were shifting, twisting unnaturally, as if they were alive. I turned toward the door, my hand reaching instinctively for the handle, but then I froze again. Something was behind me. I could feel it, a presence, cold and oppressive. My breath hitched in my throat as I dared to glance over my shoulder. There, in the corner where the light hadn't yet reached, something was moving. Slowly. Deliberately. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows. But no! As my eyes adjusted, I saw it clearly, a figure, hunched and twisted, emerging from the darkness. It wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. The shape was wrong, bent in a way that defied logic, like a broken puppet being forced to move by some unseen hand. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, dragging itself closer, step by horrifying step. A low, wet rasping sound came from it, guttural and chilling. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, my hand still clutching the watch like a lifeline. The figure took another step, then another, its movements slow but purposeful. The air around me grew colder still, as if the shed itself had become a prison, sealing me in with this thing. The mannequin in the corner seemed to twitch. A sharp, grinding sound filled the space, and for a split second, I thought I saw its head move. I blinked, and it was still again, its face as featureless as before. But something about it had changed, something subtle but wrong. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. Adrian, Adrian, come closer. The voice felt like a command, a force that gnawed at my will, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I took a step back, my foot hitting something behind me, a broken crate that shattered with a loud crack. The figure in the corner jerked its head toward the sound, its eyes, or what should have been eyes, glinting in the dark. For the first time, I saw them. There was something in those hollow sockets, something moving, slithering, writhing like a nest of worms. I stumbled back, my heart racing. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs betrayed me, locking me in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, now halfway between the corner and me, its twisted form growing closer, its breath rattling in the air. Adrian, the voice said again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, a plea, a scream all at once. My name was drawn out, tangled in a web of desperation. Come closer, Adrian. You are needed. Without thinking, I dropped the pocket watch, the cold metal hitting the wooden floor with a dull thud. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. The door, the only way out, was so close, yet it felt impossibly far. I turned and ran. The shed seemed to grow taller as I stumbled toward the door. The walls closed in, the air thick with the scent of decay. The light flickered again, casting terrifying shadows that seemed to reach for me, clawing at my skin. The figure was right behind me now. I could hear it, its twisted form dragging itself, step by agonizing step, its ragged breathing growing louder. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, the path to the door becoming uneven, treacherous. I reached for the handle, my fingers slick with sweat, but but just as I was about to push it open, a bone-chilling screech split the air. The door slammed shut in front of me, as if pushed by an invisible force. I spun around, panic flooding my chest. The figure was upon me now, its twisted limbs stretching toward me like long, bony fingers. I could see its face. No, not a face, just a mass of shifting shadows, like a black void staring back at me. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the suffocating dark. The air grew thick with dread. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the very space around me shrinking, suffocating. And then, in that moment of pure terror, the floor beneath me gave way. I fell. Down into the darkness. The last thing I heard was a voice, a whisper, just as cold and desperate as before. "You can never leave, Adrian." The darkness consumed me entirely as I plummeted. It wasn't like falling through open air. It was as if I were being pulled, sucked down into an abyss, with nothing but the cold grip of fear to accompany me. My body twisted in midair, crashing against something hard, and for a moment, everything went still. I gasped, my lungs burning, the taste of dirt and blood filling my mouth. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Where was I? How had the ground beneath me just given way? My breath echoed in the silence, each inhale rattling in my chest as the pressure of the dark settled around me. I slowly raised my head, blinking into the oppressive blackness. I couldn't see anything, couldn't even tell how far I had fallen. But I wasn't alone. The moment I focused, I could hear them. The whispers, soft, like rustling leaves at first, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. Their cadence was unsettling, as if they were speaking in some kind of chant, but the words were impossible to understand. It was as though 1,000 voices were murmuring all at once, creating an endless hum of sound that burrowed into my skull. My pulse quickened, and panic surged through me. I pushed myself up, my arms shaking as I scrambled to find my bearings. The air around me was thick, stale, like it had been trapped here for ages. My hand brushed against something cold, smooth, and unnervingly familiar. I pulled my fingers back sharply, realizing it was the walls of whatever place I had fallen into. They were rough, crumbling stone, and the moment my hand met the surface, I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on me, suffocating. The walls felt alive somehow, as if they had been waiting for me. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest. The murmuring voices grew louder, swirling around me, bouncing off the walls. Their words were still indecipherable, but their tone was unmistakable, taunting, beckoning, urging me deeper into whatever hellish place this was. I stumbled forward, trying to ignore the rising sense of dread that gripped my gut. The air was so thick now that it felt like I was wading through it, each breath harder than the last. The whispers surrounded me, closing in. And then, something else. The ground beneath me shifted, causing me to lose my balance and nearly fall again. As I caught myself, I heard the soft scraping sound, a dragging, scraping noise that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't coming from the walls, but from somewhere deeper within the darkness. I didn't want to turn around, but something compelled me. Slowly, cautiously, I shifted my gaze over my shoulder, and my blood ran cold. There, in the pitch black, a faint outline appeared, someone, crawling toward me, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Its form was distorted, grotesque. I couldn't make out many details, but I could see the glint of something sharp, something metallic, reflected faintly in the dim light that seemed to have no source. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey my mind. The creature dragged itself closer, its ragged breathing filling the air with a sickening rhythm. I could feel its presence now, closing in like it was right behind me, even though I dared not look away. Adrian. The voice again, now a croak, strained with hunger and malice. It was coming from the thing, I realized, its mouth opening in a grotesque, twisted smile. But I didn't see a face, only that horrific emptiness. With a surge of adrenaline, my limbs responded. I bolted forward, not caring what direction I was heading, just needing to get away from that thing. My feet pounded against the uneven ground, the scrape of stone beneath me a constant reminder of the depths I had fallen into. But the whispers followed, never stopping, always pressing in on me. The darkness seemed to close tighter, more suffocating with each step I took. I could feel the cold breath of the creature at my back. It was close, too close. I pushed forward, hands outstretched to guide myself through the absolute blackness. My fingers brushed over uneven surfaces, jagged rocks scraping against my skin until I felt something different. A slight shift in the air. A faint outline of something solid ahead. I reached forward with trembling hands, my breath shallow, hoping, praying that it was some kind of exit, some sign of escape. And then I felt it. A door. I pulled on the handle, panic clawing at my chest. The door creaked open with a heavy groan, and I stumbled through, half blinded by the light that suddenly flooded my vision. I fell forward, collapsing onto a hard, cold surface. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to steady myself, to focus on where I was. But the world around me was spinning, dizzying, as if reality itself had been twisted out of place. I forced myself to sit up, eyes darting around. It wasn't a room. I had somehow made it out of the cavern, but where I had emerged was worse than anything I had imagined. I was standing in a vast, open space. The walls stretched up impossibly high, disappearing into an unseen ceiling. And scattered across the floor, the objects. The very same things I had seen before in the square. Old watches, jewelry, torn clothing, shattered pottery. But now, they were not just relics of the past. They were alive. The objects twitched, moved slightly, as though they were breathing. The watches ticked in unison, a relentless rhythm that filled the air, louder and louder. The jewelry shimmered, casting strange, flickering lights across the dark stone floor. And the pieces of clothing, tattered and stained, seemed to ripple as though they were being worn by invisible bodies. But the worst part, the most terrifying part, was the center of the room. There, lying in the midst of the scattered objects, was a body. Adrian S. The name from the pocket watch. And it was alive. The body lying in the center of the room, Adrian S., wasn't just an ordinary corpse. It was alive, but not in any way that resembled life. I could see it now, the chest rising and falling, but only faintly, like the slow, unnatural breathing of something trapped, something desperate. The pale skin, dotted with strange, dark marks, was stretched thin, too thin, as though the very essence of life was being drained out of it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around me was thick with tension, the strange ticking of the watches louder now, a maddening pulse that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the room. The jewelry shimmered unnervingly, as though something was pulling the light toward them, drawing the shadows into their depths. The clothes fluttered, as though they were being worn by ghosts that were just out of sight, teasing me with their unseen movements. I tried to look away, but my eyes were fixed on the body in the center of the room. Adrian S. The name, the man, was the key. I knew it. But how? What had happened to him? Why did he look like this? His body twitched again, a convulsion that made me jump. His mouth opened, and a low, gurgling sound emerged, almost like a plea, but it was incomprehensible, like words trying to form in a language that had long been lost. His eyes were wide open now, glassy, void of any recognition, but I could feel the gaze, a cold, piercing stare that dug into my soul. I couldn't tell if he was still alive, or if he was just a vessel, some kind of twisted, hollow shell left behind by whatever dark force was at play here. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the room, and the door I had just entered slammed shut behind me. The light flickered and dimmed, and I was left in an unsettling half-light, surrounded by the moving objects and the murmurs of the room. The watches, the jewelry, the clothes. Everything in this space was alive with a kind of wrongness, a distortion that sent a shiver through my bones. I took a hesitant step forward, the ground cold beneath my feet. The body of Adrian S. seemed to shift again, more violently this time, as though it was trying to rise, struggling against some invisible force that held it in place. I moved closer, my breath caught in my throat, the strange urgency of the room pressing down on me, making every movement feel deliberate, measured. There was something beneath the body, a shadow. At first, I thought it was just the way the dim light played against the floor, but as I leaned in, I saw it more clearly. The shadow was different. It was not cast by anything physical. It was alive, shifting, swirling beneath Adrian's body, growing larger with each passing moment. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. It was then that I saw the markings on Adrian's skin more clearly, strange symbols etched deep into his flesh, like some ancient, forbidden script. The symbols were familiar, but I couldn't place them, couldn't understand their meaning. But they were unmistakable, each one glowing faintly in the dark, pulsing with the rhythm of the watches around me. I had to get out. But how? The door was locked, the room seemed endless, and the air was growing thicker, colder. The presence of the body, the shifting shadows, the whispering voices, they were all closing in, pressing in on me from all sides. I needed to understand what was happening, but the more I tried to comprehend it, the more the reality of it slipped through my fingers. Adrian S. The name echoed in my mind, like a warning, like a thread I had to follow, but I couldn't see where it led. I glanced down at the watch I had found earlier, still clutched in my hand. The cold metal seemed to hum in my palm, and for a brief moment, I thought I could hear a faint ticking coming from it, different from the watches around me. The hands of the watch were moving, but they weren't ticking in time with the others. They were backward. Slowly, agonizingly slow, the hands reversed their course, as though time itself was being undone. Suddenly, the body of Adrian S. jerked violently, and the shadow beneath it surged, coiling like a serpent. A sound, horrible and deafening, ripped through the room, a high-pitched screech that rattled my bones and made the walls tremble. The shadow stretched, expanding toward me, its shape becoming more defined, more real. And then, for the first time since I had entered this nightmare, I saw it clearly. The shadow was not just a void, it was a form, a twisted, malformed figure that hovered just above the ground. Its shape flickered, constantly changing, like a nightmare caught in the throes of transformation. It had no face, no recognizable features, only shifting shapes and lines that writhed and pulled at the fabric of reality itself. Its limbs were long, stretched impossibly thin, ending in hands with too many fingers, each one curling toward me with an almost tender, horrifying grace. Adrian, the voice rasped again, but now it was no longer a plea. It was a command. I could feel the room constricting, the walls closing in as the shadow reached out, its long, spindly fingers brushing against my skin. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my feet were glued to the floor, weighed down by the oppressive force in the air. The body of Adrian S. lifted from the ground, hovering above the floor like a marionette, its eyes rolling back into its head. The dark symbols on his skin flared, glowing brighter, almost blinding in their intensity. And then, with a sudden, violent motion, Adrian's mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and the words came out, no longer a whisper, but a roar that shook the very foundations of the room. "You should never have come here." And then, the world fell silent. I had always thought that time could heal everything. But when I moved into my new home, I quickly realized that some wounds run deeper than time can erase. The house was old, its walls thick with history and dust. Its quietness was unsettling, as if it had been abandoned for years, though it was perfectly well kept. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't the kind of feeling that comes from being paranoid or nervous, but something heavier, older. A presence that had been there long before me, waiting for me to arrive. At first, I thought it was just the silence. The house creaked and groaned like any old place would, but there was something more. The smell was faint, something metallic, like rust or blood, but it lingered in the air, just enough to make me question whether I was imagining it. I tried to ignore the strange sounds, footsteps that didn't belong to me, whispers that faded when I turned my head, the rustling of fabric in the middle of the night, but they grew louder. It was as if the house was speaking to me, but in a language I didn't understand. Or maybe it was remembering something I had no right to know. I had inherited this house from an old aunt who had passed away just a month before. Her will was vague, mentioning nothing about the house's history or why she had chosen to leave it to me, her only living relative. She had lived here alone for as long as I could remember, rarely speaking of the past. My only connection to her was the occasional holiday card or the brief, distant chats we'd had when I was young. When she died, I was left with nothing but her belongings, furniture, books, and a house that seemed to be filled with the ghosts of her solitude. The first night I spent here, I slept fitfully. The silence was oppressive, like it was trying to smother me. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, convinced I had heard voices, faint, distant, like whispers from behind the walls. I chalked it up to my imagination, to the stress of moving in alone. But then, I found the corner. I had been unpacking when I noticed a small room at the back of the house, tucked away behind a door that seemed to blend into the wall itself. The door was old, painted a dull, peeling white, with a brass handle that had been worn down over the years. It was almost as though it had been forgotten, left alone in the house's past. When I opened it, I stepped into a narrow space, barely large enough to be called a room. The air was colder in there, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. It felt like a place that hadn't been touched in years. The walls were covered in what looked like old, faded wallpaper. But when I looked closer, I saw something strange, markings. Scrawls etched into the wallpaper itself, some faded, some still clear. Words or symbols, I couldn't quite make them out, but the feeling they gave me was unmistakable. It was as if the house was trying to tell me something it had never spoken before. And whatever it wasn't something I wanted to know. I couldn't help but feel drawn to it, the markings on the walls, the smell of rot that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the room. But the more I looked, the more I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. It was like the house was warning me, telling me to leave, to go back to the safety of the world outside its walls. But it wasn't just a room. The whole house seemed to be alive with a quiet, brooding energy. I could hear things at night, scratching, like something was trying to get out from within the walls. The floorboards creaked under invisible footsteps. And no matter how much I cleaned, the musty air always returned, thick and choking. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone crying. It was faint, but unmistakable. A low, mournful sobbing, as if someone was trapped, waiting for help that would never come. I followed the sound through the house, my heart racing, my breath shallow. It led me to the door of the room in the corner. I hesitated, standing in front of it, wondering if I had been hearing things. But then, the sobs grew louder, and I could feel the coldness seeping through the cracks of the door. I opened it. The room was empty, but the markings on the walls had changed. The words, no longer just random scratches, had formed a sentence. A warning. You are not alone. I closed the door quickly, heart pounding in my chest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had just spoken to me, not with words, but with the language of the past. And I knew, deep down, that I was not the first to hear it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper in the dark, made my skin crawl. I felt the presence again, not just in the house, but within me. The walls were closing in, and I wasn't sure if it was the house that was changing or if it was me. I had to know more. What had happened here? What was the house trying to tell me? But some things are better left unknown. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was me. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, all of it seemed to lean in closer, as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. I couldn't stop thinking about that room in the corner. Every time I passed by the door, I felt the pull again, like an invisible hand beckoning me closer. The markings on the walls were more than just old scratches. They were warnings, messages, but from who? And what did they mean? That night, I couldn't resist. I had to go back. I needed to understand. I gathered my courage and made my way to the door once more, the old brass handle cold under my touch. My heartbeat quickened. I pushed it open, the creaking sound reverberating in the silence of the house. As soon as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. I had always thought that time could heal everything. But when I moved into my new home, I quickly realized that some wounds run deeper than time can erase. The house was old, its walls thick with history and dust. Its quietness was unsettling, as if it had been abandoned for years, though it was perfectly well kept. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't the kind of feeling that comes from being paranoid or nervous, but something heavier, older. A presence that had been there long before me, waiting for me to arrive. At first, I thought it was just the silence. The house creaked and groaned like any old place would, but there was something more. The smell was faint, something metallic, like rust or blood, but it lingered in the air, just enough to make me question whether I was imagining it. I tried to ignore the strange sounds, footsteps that didn't belong to me, whispers that faded when I turned my head, the rustling of fabric in the middle of the night, but they grew louder. It was as if the house was speaking to me, but in a language I didn't understand. Or maybe it was remembering something I had no right to know. I had inherited this house from an old aunt who had passed away just a month before. Her will was vague, mentioning nothing about the house's history or why she had chosen to leave it to me, her only living relative. She had lived here alone for as long as I could remember, rarely speaking of the past. My only connection to her was the occasional holiday card or the brief, distant chats we'd had when I was young. When she died, I was left with nothing but her belongings, furniture, books, and a house that seemed to be filled with the ghosts of her solitude. The first night I spent here, I slept fitfully. The silence was oppressive, like it was trying to smother me. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, convinced I had heard voices, faint, distant, like whispers from behind the walls. I chalked it up to my imagination, to the stress of moving in alone. But then, I found the corner. I had been unpacking when I noticed a small room at the back of the house, tucked away behind a door that seemed to blend into the wall itself. The door was old, painted a dull, peeling white, with a brass handle that had been worn down over the years. It was almost as though it had been forgotten, left alone in the house's past. When I opened it, I stepped into a narrow space, barely large enough to be called a room. The air was colder in there, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. It felt like a place that hadn't been touched in years. The walls were covered in what looked like old, faded wallpaper. But when I looked closer, I saw something strange, markings. Scrawls etched into the wallpaper itself, some faded, some still clear. Words or symbols, I couldn't quite make them out, but the feeling they gave me was unmistakable. It was as if the house was trying to tell me something it had never spoken before. And whatever it wasn't something I wanted to know. I couldn't help but feel drawn to it, the markings on the walls, the smell of rot that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the room. But the more I looked, the more I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. It was like the house was warning me, telling me to leave, to go back to the safety of the world outside its walls. But it wasn't just a room. The whole house seemed to be alive with a quiet, brooding energy. I could hear things at night, scratching, like something was trying to get out from within the walls. The floorboards creaked under invisible footsteps. And no matter how much I cleaned, the musty air always returned, thick and choking. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone crying. It was faint, but unmistakable. A low, mournful sobbing, as if someone was trapped, waiting for help that would never come. I followed the sound through the house, my heart racing, my breath shallow. It led me to the door of the room in the corner. I hesitated, standing in front of it, wondering if I had been hearing things. But then, the sobs grew louder, and I could feel the coldness seeping through the cracks of the door. I opened it. The room was empty. But the markings on the walls had changed. The words, no longer just random scratches, had formed a sentence. A warning. You are not alone. I closed the door quickly, heart pounding in my chest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had just spoken to me, not with words, but with the language of the past. And I knew, deep down, that I was not the first to hear it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper in the dark, made my skin crawl. I felt the presence again, not just in the house, but within me. The walls were closing in, and I wasn't sure if it was the house that was changing or if it was me. I had to know more. What had happened here? What was the house trying to tell me? But some things are better left unknown. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was me. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, all of it seemed to lean in closer, as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. I couldn't stop thinking about that room in the corner. Every time I passed by the door, I felt the pull again, like an invisible hand beckoning me closer. The markings on the walls were more than just old scratches. They were warnings, messages, but from who? And what did they mean? That night, I couldn't resist. I had to go back. I needed to understand. I gathered my courage and made my way to the door once more, the old brass handle cold under my touch. My heartbeat quickened. I pushed it open, the creaking sound reverberating in the silence of the house. As soon as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. The markings on the walls seemed different now, more distinct, more deliberate. They weren't just random scratches. No, they were forming patterns. Symbols. Symbols I couldn't recognize. I moved closer, running my fingers over the faded ink. The air around me seemed to hum, and my skin prickled, as though the room was alive, breathing with me. Then, I saw something in the corner of the room, an old, worn-out chest. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. The wood was chipped and faded, as though it had been untouched for decades. The brass latch gleamed in the dim light, almost mocking me. It was calling me. I had to open it. I hesitated for a moment, the rational part of me screaming to leave, but my hands moved on their own. I unlatched the chest with a sharp click, and when the lid creaked open, a rush of cold air spilled out, like it had been locked away for far too long. Inside, there was nothing but dust and old papers. But as I sifted through the contents, my fingers brushed against something strange. A small, weathered box. It was intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. A chill ran down my spine as I held it in my hands. The box was strangely warm, as though it had been waiting for me. I opened it. Inside, there was a single, yellowed letter written in a script I couldn't decipher. The ink had long since faded, but there was something unmistakably familiar about the handwriting. It was almost as though it belonged to someone I knew. I didn't know why I read it. Perhaps it was the sense of urgency that gnawed at me, the feeling that this letter had to be read, had to be understood. But as my eyes skimmed the words, a cold, suffocating dread washed over me. They never leave. They can't. They are bound here, as we are. Time is not what you think it is. I dropped the letter as if it had burned me. The box fell to the floor with a soft thud, and the room seemed to darken around me, as though the very air had thickened with some unseen presence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What did it mean? Who had written this? And why did it feel like the house was closing in around me, swallowing me whole? A soft sound interrupted my thoughts. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder. And clearer. Help me. The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, a faint, desperate plea that twisted my insides. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the voice persisted, seeping into my very bones. I turned toward the door, my legs shaking beneath me. The room seemed to shift, the walls warping, the air thickening, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing at the edges. I could feel it. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it was feeding on me. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I rushed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it snapped shut with a loud bang. My heart thudded in my chest as I tugged at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering was growing louder, closer, until it felt like the voice was right behind me. You shouldn't have come. Panic surged through me. I screamed, pulling at the door, but it wouldn't open. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in, the air becoming more suffocating by the second. My chest tightened, my throat closing up as if I was being crushed. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the pressure lifted. The door swung open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The house was still, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it watching me. Whatever it was, whatever presence lurked within these walls, it wasn't done with me. It was waiting, and I wasn't sure I could escape it. That night, sleep didn't come. The silence was deafening, but underneath it, I could hear it, the faintest whisper, calling my name. I wasn't alone, and I never would be again. I barely slept that night. The whispering had stayed with me, haunting the edges of my thoughts. Even as I lay motionless in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond my reach. The house, though silent on the surface, felt alive, its every creak, every shift in the foundation, resonating like a heartbeat. It was no longer a house to me. It was something far darker. The next morning, I tried to push it all aside. I needed to think clearly, to move forward. But as I walked through the house, every step felt like it was being watched. The air in the hallway seemed thicker now, more oppressive. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows felt muted, as if it were trying to escape from something unseen. The silence between the rooms was suffocating. Each door I passed seemed to whisper its own secret, a secret that was just out of reach, but impossible to ignore. I tried to distract myself by sorting through the boxes I had yet to unpack. But even as I opened the first box, I found myself hesitating. I knew what I would find before I even looked inside. It was the feeling, that sensation that everything here was wrong. There was a picture framed in the box. An old photograph of a family standing in front of this very house, my house. The people were unfamiliar, but their expressions sent a chill through me. They were smiling, but it wasn't a smile that reached their eyes. Their eyes, they were hollow, empty, as though they had witnessed something they could never forget. Or something that would never let them forget. I dropped the frame in shock, but it didn't hit the ground. The edges of the frame hovered above the floor for a moment before settling gently down, as though guided by an invisible hand. My heart skipped a beat. That wasn't possible. I couldn't stay in this room any longer. I quickly moved into the kitchen, trying to ignore the unnerving feeling that was crawling up my spine. But the house was relentless. It followed me. I hadn't made it 5 steps before I heard it again, the whisper. The voice. This time it was clearer, as if it had been standing behind me all along, waiting for me to turn around. I spun on my heels, my pulse racing, but there was nothing. Nothing but the kitchen, the sunlight, and the creeping sense of dread that had taken root in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The house didn't answer. But the whisper did, again, softer this time, just a breath on the air. "Help me. You have to help me." The sound came from the walls, from everywhere, as if it were part of the very structure of the house itself. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, more insistent. "They won't let me go." I staggered backward, my back hitting the counter. The air felt thick, stifling. It was as though the walls were closing in around me, pressing against my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I could hear it now, scraping sounds, faint at first, but unmistakable. Like something, or someone, was moving behind the walls. I turned to look at the door, the only escape, but it was already closing. The sound of the latch clicking shut echoed through the house, and the room plunged into darkness. The light above flickered, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting into long, dark shapes that lurked just out of sight. I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but it was impossible. The walls were alive. The house was alive. And it wanted me to know it. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. I whirled around, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body felt frozen in place. The house was shifting, the walls groaning and creaking as though they were alive, straining under some invisible weight. And then I saw it. A figure, a shadow, moving swiftly across the hallway. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form shifting and distorting in the dim light. I could see the outline of its body, but its face was nothing. Just a void, a darkness that seemed to absorb the very light around it. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. What was it? What was it trying to do? Was it real? Or was it just another manifestation of this nightmare I couldn't escape? The whispering began again, this time from all directions. It was no longer just a voice, it was a chorus of voices, overlapping, pleading, warning. The words blurred together until they were nothing but a cacophony of despair. You can't leave. You belong here. You will never leave. I felt it then, the cold hand on my shoulder. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the emptiness of the house, waiting for me to break, to give in. The door to the hallway opened slowly, creaking on its hinges. Someone, was waiting for me on the other side. I had to face it. I had no choice. The door creaked open, inch by inch, its groan deafening in the otherwise still air. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, and I felt as if my limbs had turned to stone, frozen by the suffocating atmosphere that gripped the house. Each second stretched out, like time itself was waiting for something to happen, waiting for me to step into the unknown. But I couldn't move. The whispering, the scraping, the hollow shadows, everything around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a sign. And then, just as I thought I might break from the pressure, I saw it. A shape, darker than the darkness itself, standing motionless just beyond the doorway. Its outline was vague, shifting like a mirage. It was tall, too tall, and its presence felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. There was no face, no defining features, just the unsettling sensation of something ancient and malevolent lurking behind its form. I forced my legs to move, slowly at first, unsure whether to run or face whatever stood before me. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from it. The more I stared, the more it seemed to come alive, pulsing with energy like a storm waiting to erupt. Then it spoke. But not in words. No, it was something else, something deep, primal. It wasn't a voice, it was a feeling, a vibration that rattled my bones, sending a chill through my spine. I could feel its intentions, its hunger. It wanted something from me. It wanted my fear. You cannot escape, the voice reverberated inside my skull, the words both foreign and familiar at once. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. I clenched my fists, trying to hold onto some semblance of reality. In that instant, I remembered something buried deep in my mind, something I had long forgotten. This house had been built on pain. The previous owners, they had not left by choice. I had heard whispers in town before, rumors of disappearances, of tragedies that were never fully explained. And now, as I stood there, staring into the abyss of that shifting figure, I understood. The house was a prison, and we were its prisoners. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I bolted toward the hallway, my feet barely touching the ground as I rushed to escape. The air felt suffocating, thick with something unseen but very real. Behind me, the door slammed shut, and the whispering began again, louder now, angrier, as if the house itself were retaliating. "You belong here." I stumbled down the hallway, my vision narrowing as the walls seemed to close in. The darkness seemed to pulse with each step, its cold tendrils wrapping around my limbs, pulling me back toward that monstrous presence. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, followed me, echoing in the empty house. No matter how fast I ran, it was as though the house was moving with me, pushing me further into its grasp. Finally, I reached the staircase and bolted up, desperate to get to the second floor, to escape whatever was stalking me. But as I reached the top step, I froze. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was the same figure, waiting. The shadows seemed to consume the space around it, distorting the walls, the ceiling. The very air felt thick with an oppressive weight. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and my heart thudded in my chest, louder than any sound the house had ever made. "You will never leave," the voice whispered again, and I could feel it clawing at my mind, suffocating me from the inside. I backed away slowly, trying to control my breathing, but it was useless. There was no escape. There never had been. Just as I turned to flee down the other hallway, the door to the attic flew open with a violent slam. I had no choice. My instincts told me to run, but something deep within urged me toward the attic. It wasn't a choice. It was a compulsion, something primal that I couldn't fight. As I ascended the narrow stairs, the darkness pressed closer, suffocating me with every step. The attic was colder than the rest of the house, its air thick with dust and age. The space was small, cramped with old trunks, boxes, and forgotten relics. But there, in the far corner, was something that shouldn't have been there. A mirror. It stood against the wall, its frame ornate, decorated with intricate carvings that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The glass was fogged, but as I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat, I saw it. Not my reflection, but something else, something moving. It was the figure from the hallway. It was standing behind me in the reflection, its face just inches from mine. But this time, I could see it clearly, its features twisted in a grotesque mockery of a human face. Its eyes were empty, hollow sockets, like two gaping holes into an infinite void. Its mouth stretched open, but no sound came from it. Instead, the air around me grew colder, and I could feel the weight of its presence behind me, as if it were pressing against me, waiting. I tried to turn, to look over my shoulder, but when I did, the figure was gone. But I knew it wasn't. It was still there, somewhere. Watching. Waiting. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it had me. The mirror trembled as I took a step back, my breath shallow, my body rigid with terror. The air in the attic felt unnaturally cold now, a biting chill that seeped into my bones, wrapping itself around my heart like an icy vice. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the glass, where the figure had been moments ago, where it still lingered in the corner of my mind. I could feel its presence even though I knew, deep down, that it wasn't there. The house creaked around me, the walls groaning as if in agony, as if the very structure was alive and suffering. The whispering had become louder now, rising from the dark corners of the attic, swirling around me like an unseen storm. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a feeling, a constant pressure in the air, making my chest tighten with every breath. I turned, instinctively, to the door. But before I could move, the attic light flickered, casting the room into darkness for a split second. When it returned, I gasped. The figure was in front of me now, blocking the stairs. Its outline was clearer, sharper, more defined. It wasn't just a shadow, it had substance. Its body was long and twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, reaching out toward me in a grotesque, jerking motion. Its faces, twisted together like writhing, overlapping shapes, shifting in and out of focus, neither human nor beast. Each new form was worse than the last. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were empty voids, and its mouth opened, stretching wider with every second, releasing a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards, rattling my bones. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, oppressive, and the walls seemed to close in. The house was alive with it, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every beat of my heart. I could feel the weight of it, the horror, the inevitability, bearing down on me. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. My feet moved on their own, stumbling backward as the creature inched closer. The world around me seemed to blur and distort, the edges of my vision pulling inward, as if everything was being drawn into the mirror, the dark reflection of what I had seen. It was suffocating, and I could feel my mind slipping, the edges of reality fraying. "Leave me alone," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the increasing roar of the whispering voices that filled the room. The words felt empty, like a last, desperate plea to a world that was no longer listening. The creature didn't respond. It didn't need to. I turned to flee, but the stairs, those narrow, rickety steps that had once seemed like an escape, now seemed to stretch infinitely upward, disappearing into the darkness. There was no way out. The attic had become a prison, a cage with no exit. Then, the house shuddered. It was a violent shake that rattled the windows and sent dust falling from the ceiling. The light flickered again, casting brief, stuttering shadows across the room. And in that split second, the creature was gone. It vanished without a sound, leaving only the oppressive silence that now filled the attic. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the next moment, for the next thing to happen. But there was nothing. The air was still, unnaturally still. The oppressive presence, the suffocating terror, was gone. Yet, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, a deep, unsettling sense that the silence was not peace, it was the calm before the storm. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the attic, desperate for any sign of movement, any indication of where the creature had gone. Then, I saw it. The mirror. It stood against the far wall, its surface now impossibly clear. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. There, in the reflection, was me. But the reflection wasn't quite right. My face was pale, drawn, my eyes wide with fear, but that wasn't what made me tremble. It was the figure standing behind me, just out of the corner of my eye in the mirror. It wasn't the same creature from before, but it was something worse. It was me, or at least, someone who looked like me. A twisted, warped version of myself, its face contorted into a grotesque, mocking smile. I turned sharply, but the attic was empty. The cold, empty space around me mocked my every movement. I was alone, but the reflection remained, watching. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if the house had truly driven me to this point. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized the truth. I wasn't alone in this house. Not anymore. The walls had been filled with the memories of the lost, the souls that had once lived here, and they weren't going anywhere. And neither was I. The air grew colder again, and I could hear the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. The house, the thing that had become my prison, was alive. And it was waiting for me to break. I turned, not daring to look at the mirror one last time, and bolted for the door. The shadows reached for me as I ran, clawing at my heels, whispering my name. The house was closing in, suffocating me, and I couldn't breathe. And as I stepped into the hallway, I knew, deep down, that the nightmare had only just begun. The house had claimed me. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.